Hello and welcome to Word and Words. I'm Andrew Noble with Wyatt Graham and Phil Quatnoir or Cotnoir, something like that. I'm not French. But Wyatt,
No one can say his last name. It's
you
impossible.
speak French. Your recent Substack is in French and you went to Quebec to teach ethics, which is pretty cool, which we're not talking about today though. Today we are talking about the image of God in the technological age. What does it mean to be in the image of God? And how does that relate to a world in which there are all these images and there are all sorts of techniques that are employed that a lot of people argue dehumanize us or make us more inhuman. One of the angles that I want to think about this is to really define image of God well. I think there's kind of this vague notion of the image of God in people's minds that we have it. And there's a book that I've been working through, Dignity and Destiny by John Kilner. And it's recommended by many people. The subtitle is Humanity in the Image of God. And he makes a key distinction between the image of God and being in the image of God. He says that never in the Bible is it said that we are the image of God. Well, except for that one time in 1 Corinthians where man is the image of God. So he has to deal with that still. But his overall argument is that unlike most of church history that has said we have lost or there is something wrong with the image of God now in some way, he says, no, there is never anything wrong with the image of God because that is Jesus Christ. We are only made in the image of God. The image of God is the standard for us to live into. And so there is a functional aspect that flows out of it, Kilner says. But at the end of the day, the image of God is not, being in the image of God is something that we always have purely holistically. And anything else is like a part that quote unquote flows out of that. And that just disagrees with Augustine and Calvin and others in the Reformed tradition, Bavinck as well, who would make a distinction between the ontological image and the functional image and say that there are two aspects, not just one. And they would say, sure, enough, Kilner. I mean, obviously they can't talk to Kilner, but sure enough, there is an ontological aspect of the image of God. Bavinck says, of course, you cannot take away the aspect of what we are made into. That ontological aspect remains. Bavinck doesn't use the word ontological, he uses narrow and broad, but he gets to the same point. The functional part is the part that we just don't do very well. We are made in the image to rule the world, and we don't do it very well. We failed, and so there's a flawed or tainted or damaged aspect to the image. This is what Martin Luther said. This is what John Calvin said and others said. And so what I've kind of wrestled with is basically disagreeing with Kilner. And even though it's a book that a lot of people like, partially because of the Reformed tradition and partially, I think, because of the biblical evidence itself. Do you guys agree with me? Am I tracking with how you've understood the image of God? Because it seems to be this essential aspect. We all agree with how we deal with human beings and anthropological questions today.
One just kind of follow-up question before I maybe make a comment. So, because I haven't read the book yet, I literally, while you were talking, ordered it on Amazon. I found a used copy. So
Wow.
It was too expensive to buy new, but I found a used one. So, is his argument the image of God is Christ, and we're in the image of God? But like, how does he avoid the ontological and functional divide? I kind of maybe missed the.
So he agrees with the ontological.
Yeah.
He just says that the functional is not what that's related to, but it's not the same as being in the image of God.
I see. And he says that he disagrees with, I guess, Bavinck, Calvin, and some of the earlier tradition.
Augustine as well. He goes at length. He's very encyclopedic is how one reviewer put it, because almost every sentence has a footnote, and he's like, I really actually respect him for so comprehensively capturing what other Christians and scholars have said about this. Yeah.
So I'll just give you my reflection based on how you, because I haven't read the book yet. I can't say that I have, like, I can't truly respond
Right.
if that makes sense, but just based on the discussion. Both Athanasius and Calvin say the image of God is Christ. Um, Virtually all the fathers that I know of would have an ontological definition of the image of God. For example, like Gregory of Nyssa would talk about the image of God as being in our, according to will. So there is a sense of function there, but it's based on, so basically it's based on a principle that for the Cappadocians in particular, that the nature of a thing has a power or a potency, if you're more in Aristotle, a power. And if you do an activity that belongs to that power, you are the thing itself. So for a human being to be created in the image of God would be to have the potency to will the good or evil, for example. And since you can do that, you would, in essence, be above. I haven't read him on this recently, so this is also kind of, I might be misstating some of the details, but you would have the power to transcend not only the nutritive creation, namely plants, the irrational animal creation, namely the animals, but then you would have all those within yourself, but be beyond them through the capacity to choose between good and evil, more or less. So it seems to me that, like, as I reflect on a common strand of the patristic tradition and even the Reformed tradition, that act follows being. I mean, that's more Thomistic, but that's a principle. The earlier way of putting it is that activities flow from power, or energia follow from dunamis, and dunamis is something proper to a essence, a essentia, or sorry, that'd be a wrong language, but anyways, the essence. Ousia would be the correct language if I'm talking Greek. So as you explained it, I didn't detect a giant rejection, at least of some strands of thinking of the image of God. I
Hmm.
did detect an emphasis. Like, I know Bavinck has a more holistic perspective of the image of God. Calvin, I'm not
Because with
certain that he
Bavinck, it's
disagrees with
more like
Calvin.
all. Bavinck, it's more like all humanity gets captured into the image of God because it's unity
Yeah,
and
there's a
pluriformity
more,
and all
it's
that.
all kinds of things. And now then there's other traditions among early Christians that I think are helpful, like to be created in the image and the likeness. For some, early referred to two different things, two overlapping things, by the way, not like they were so different, but overlapping things. Um, and then another piece to the puzzle would be like, I think most people agree that the way in which you could be in God's image accords by an analogy of proportion to what God is. So if God is spirit and doesn't have nerves and veins and a colon, then probably nerves and vein and colon by themselves don't equal the image of God, but something about them, for example, the way they mediate our world around us and the way that we, through our sensory organs, are able to understand and see and so on, has an analogy to God. So God knows all things, sees all things, not through eyes like we have, but he sees all things through his the mode of perception. So eyesight for him would be an analogy for his all-seeingness or whatever. So there's a sense in which that would actually still locate the image more ontologically. The functional one seems to be, the functional emphasis seems to be really late 20th century to me in terms of emphasis. Like Anthony Hoekema and others, if memory serves, really go in that direction. I know in the new book by it's not that new anymore, like Peter Gentry and Wellham, is that the one? Yes, Kingdom Through Covenant.
Yeah, yeah.
They seem to emphasize that through the functional part of the image of God, through a relation made between ancient Near Eastern linguistic data, and there's something there, of course. I mean, of course, in the form of after creating the image of God, the form of the blessing is be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and take dominion over it. So there is a movement from what you are to what you do. I don't think anyone, as far as I know, has really denied that. But usually it'd be organized through your acts follow from what you are.
Yeah, well, and that's what Kilner is kind of saying. It's like, well, you are made in the image of God, but this stuff that comes out of it is distinct from being in the image of God. It just flows from it. Like he one of his concerns is that if we don't have a clear understanding of all human beings being made in the image of God and having that and not losing it or having a damaged aspect, if we see some as more in the image of God because they better follow or reflect God than others, then we might end up in a scenario where we're not treating everyone equally. We're doing slavery and stuff. And so he opens the book with some of the potential concerns if you don't have that. But yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's always helpful to understand what a particular thinker is concerned with guarding against, as that often motivates the shape of their argument. For sure, we've seen how if you link the image of God to some human capacity, then those humans who lack it suddenly, by definition, sort of have are less in the image of God than others, and we want to avoid that. And so the way I've heard it argued, and I haven't read as deeply as you guys in this area, but that basically you want to avoid coupling our definition of what it means to be in the image of God from some human capacity, which maybe a nonverbal autistic child, cannot exhibit or something like that. So those concerns kind of drive the shape of the argument, and that's always helpful to see. I think one thing that I'm curious about, and maybe you guys have something to say in this regard, is, as I look at anthropology, how we understand the human person to be. This is kind of related to the image of God. There's been such a huge shift from pre-modern understanding of the human person to what we've had in let's say the 20th century, by and large, has been a very mechanistic, biological machine kind of view of the human person. And I think that has, we've absorbed some of that in the church. And so I wonder how our understanding of the image of God has changed as the cultural perception of what it means to be a human person has changed. Those two things, how do those relate, and how have they changed together, if at all?
Well, I think on one hand I think there is a clear tradition around the image of God relating to some of the things Wyatt was talking about, some of the rational powers. The essence is not lost, or the ontological aspect is not lost. We remain in his image. Sometimes there's been a distinction made, like Irenaeus does, between the image proper and the likeness. The likeness of God is lost due to sin, whereas the image is retained. And so there's sometimes those sorts of ways of dividing the two. Right. But I do think, to your point, I do think we are understanding, like, there is a Christian teaching, and that is separate from our actual beliefs sometimes, right? Just to state the obvious here, we're trying to align our beliefs with Christian teaching. And I think we misunderstand ourselves when we think about ourselves in machine-like terms. And that's absolutely Mary Migley. She wrote a book called The Myths We Live By. And she says that this began thinking about ourselves as machines. I think she says I think it's in the 18th century, kind of with the rise of machines. Then you had a self-understanding of humans starting to use machines as metaphors. The metaphors, the myths we live by. This gets into Postman. He adapted McLuhan's "The medium is the message" to "the medium is the metaphor." Metaphors are the things by which we live. And yeah, Mary Migley does that kind of breakdown. She has a really good quote that it's quoted in this book, The Christian Philosophy as a Way of Life, by Ross Inman. And he quotes her to talk about this exact thing that you said, this mechanized, mechanistic, I don't know, I'm not saying it right. But we kind of view ourselves like pieces of a machine. So then it's like, oh, you have a problem with your foot, you go to a foot doctor, right? And it's a very it's a very we only think about ourselves as a combination of parts, and so we actually do not think about ourselves in the day to day as more than the sum of our parts, and that's because of this kind of, as we've looked through the microscope and seen that, oh, there's these little things that make the bigger things, we don't start to appreciate the difference between a living being with a soul and one who doesn't. And that's kind of gets into enchantment discourse, actually, in many ways. But yeah, the image of God remains even when we have sin and all this kind of stuff and we don't functionally live it out. And the technological age that we live in has shaped us to understand ourselves in ways that I don't think are as holistic as what Bavinck, for example, has.
Yeah, I'd even add that the Genesis narrative itself, in the order of filling the world in days 4, 5, and 6, argue for a really tangible and holistic view of what it means to be in the image and likeness of God. I kind of noted it earlier just by summarizing Nissa's view, but I think he's right in his Bible reading that one of the significances of humanity being created on day 6, and for them to be very good, is because they include within themselves all the elements of the main elements of the prior created matter before. They have stuff in them, but they also have the forms of life. They have the form of life of the nutritive life. You just grow, photosynthesis, all that kind of stuff. Not that we work by photosynthesis, but you know what I mean. We grow like the plant life does. We also include within ourselves that which irrational animals are through the natural begetting, procreation, basic instincts, all that kind of stuff. And then we include something unique in that we are sort of capstone to these earlier and lower forms of life, namely that we're created in the image and likeness of God. And as a consequence, we have a particular dignity, which means that we can not only be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, but as we do this as a sort of capstone on the filling of the earth in days 4, 5, and 6, we're the ongoing fillers, if you want to put it that way, continue the creation of God.
Mm-hmm.
Not creation like God does, but of course creation like humans can do.
No, but we reflect that.
Yeah, and we all have within ourselves all the lower orders of creation, which gives us the particular status for dominion and caretaking of God's creation. Caretaking is key in dominion. Dominion to us in a post-fallen world often requires violence. In a pre-fallen world, it's like the garden. You tend to keep the garden and defend it, yes, from intruders like that serpent, but it doesn't require a despot. You know, we kind of think of that today. I think it requires much more like tending and keeping the garden, which is why, you know, I think you should love what's near you, as Roger Scruton might say, which can include the environment and so on. But all that to say is, I think when it comes to the image of God, it's much more humane than we think. It's not through the logic of calculation, quantity, the logic of machinery, as Mary. I always thought it was Midgley, but maybe it is Migley. I guess
I don't know. I always mispronounce names because I read them and then I end up saying them out loud.
My brain had her pronounced differently, but I don't know that I'm right, actually.
I don't know either.
So yeah, I think it's intensely humane. It's part of a hierarchical biological sequence, so that we are a microcosm of the universe that God created, namely by being created in day 6. So as a microcosm in the highest peak of the hierarchy, technology is actually below where we are, as articulated by Genesis 4 in the post-fallen world, nonetheless, but through God's grace. Technology is a tool for human flourishing, for being fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth, but it's not a replacement of, nor higher in the hierarchy. It's actually it's a tool for humane enculturation based on the image of God. So I think we've probably misplaced priorities, where if we organize ourselves as tools, we're actually lowering ourselves to a lower echelon of the hierarchical cosmos that God created and giving up something that God has called us to. And while I wouldn't say it's like a sin of commission or a high-handed sin to live that way, it is a disorder of the created order. And as a disorder, it is morally wrong to subsume ourselves into the tools themselves, rather than let the tools be subsumed into the acts that that humans do, namely culture, agriculture, viticulture, music culture, city culture, cosmopolitan culture, like all the stuff in Genesis 3 and 4 and the rest of the Bible, of course. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, what that makes me think of is, you're talking about our relationship to tools and how there's a call it a dehumanizing if we think of like the proper dignity that humans are afforded in terms of where they're placed in that hierarchy of the created order. Um, Technological society sort of encourages us to dehumanize ourselves in a number of ways that I think we need to reckon with, including all the way going back to the Industrial Revolution, where basically human beings were, largely embedded into a giant factory to produce some output. And you do see a lot of social ills flowing out from that disruption to the previous way that economic and family life was oriented. And then beyond that to the digital age, I mean, Andrew, maybe you could speak to this, but there are some profound ways, it seems to me, or at least it seems to be a collective intuition that here, like, let's say 10, 12 years into social media, internet, we are realizing as a society that living in this way is somehow deeply inhuman, dehumanizing in some way, and it's bringing us, if we're not careful about how we do it, the sort of the built-in telos of these tools, especially as they're you know designed by companies that want to hijack your brain chemistry and all this stuff. They do tend to bring us, I would say, like to a lower level, like we're yeah. Anyways, any thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I was talking with my father-in-law. He grew up in the Netherlands, and he told me that when he was a kid, they the society was such that there was a group of people who were against cameras. Do not take pictures of yourself, and do not have pictures of yourself because you should not have any other image, because their understanding of idolatry was creating any image in any form or whatever. I don't agree with that. I think it's okay to make images, but we do live in a radically different world than what we once lived in terms of seeing images of ourselves. Like even right now, I'm seeing an image of myself on the screen. I try to move the screen so I mostly don't see myself, but it's the nature of our digital mediums and the way that Zoom.
I only look at myself and no one else.
Of course. So yeah, like there is a natural tendency with social media. If they want to make money, they are going to tap into one of the 7 deadly sins. Like they just have to. Lust, pride, greed. It's going to be something there. Envy. They're going to tap into one of those sins, and a lot of it is the pride and the vanity that comes with seeing yourself and seeing an image, and you make it a perfect image. So then you create something in your likeness online, and it's the problem with it is it's digitized. It's lifeless. It's not really you. It's this other that's not wholly you, and it lacks so many of the holistic components of what actually makes you. It's not to say that you can't have a digital profile online. Like I can add a bunch of caveats here, but the natural training of our digital medium, if you every day do something the same way, and that's what we do with social media, then it trains you towards seeing an image of yourself and acclimatizing your habits to ensure that others serve and honor that image. And I think there's a book by Richard Lintz called Identity and Idolatry. And so what he does is he basically makes this case, not from a digital technology perspective, but just from a biblical perspective, that we are made to be in the image of God, And and the same word for image used in Genesis is the same that's used when Moses has the Decalogue, and the second command, it's image. I think it's salam or something like that. But it's a replacement image that happens. And so there is a role that we have uniquely to reflect God, that is not, and to function in that image by ruling creation, by ruling the garden. Our garden includes technology. So there's latent potentiality in the garden that Adam had. If Adam didn't and Eve didn't sin, you would have had technology in the garden, I believe. There was potential there. And so instead of living out that image, we function as a lesser than it, even though we still ontologically have the essence of it. And we use other images to honor, to be places of honor and respect and worship. And I think that's what social media does. It's creating images fundamentally. It's a misplacement of what we were designed to do and the light that we are supposed to reflect.
Yeah, I think one piece I would add, coming from a different direction than you, Andrew, is that I'm really convinced that in The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis kind of gets it right in ways that we don't always appreciate. And one of the things that he argues is that while our education, our technological age, our technique-driven age does sort of shape us and dehumanize us, The Abolition of Man, if he does admit the possibility that if we train our hearts in connection to our lower and higher parts, our reasoning and our feelings, we might say, then you actually can understand and live in the technological age by adapting yourself to the natural order of things, rather than by being transformed by the external world around you. And there's an interesting thing. I'm kind of piecing together something that Phil said and something that you said, Andrew, I guess. Phil was talking about how it kind of dehumanizes us and blah, blah, blah. But I do think that if we're shaped by the technological age around us, allow that to become the sort of image of who we are, a calculating, machine-like organism, then the very things that make being human elevating and good, things like hope, gets replaced by calculation. Not necessarily despair, but calculation. It's like a sliding scale of probabilities. Things like joy get replaced by, let's say, efficiency and satisfaction in efficiency. And what ends up happening is you have a lot of people who are driven, just to live their lives to meet these sort of like calculative goals, these sort of calendar invite goals. And I kind of wonder what that actually means for human flourishing. Like, just for one example, I was reading this book today by Christine Rosen called The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. And the author brings up how, I can't remember the whole context, but there's a tour guide happening in some museum, and his tour guide gave little information, and he overheard a different tour guide giving more information. And the person the author summarizes says, wouldn't this be better if the experience was standardized? And then created an app to standardize museum experiences so it's all the same. Now, if you think that's good for being human, that all experience is the same because it's standardized, quantified, and computerized, then you'll do that. But it strikes me that you're probably losing something of the zest of what it means to be human. If a mediated robot, can give you the experience, then how is that a personal experience? I was at Eastside Barrios. We had this like gift certificate thing, so we went there, and they actually had robots bring food out. It's just like this weird world that we live in, with a waiter, of course. So I'm kind of piecing together some things that I'm not sure I have a crazy big point, but I do think there's something important about being human and enjoying what it means to be human, and joy, hope, all this kind of stuff. That the digital, the technological, the technique-driven, the quantity-based life robs you of. And you may end up being satisfied, but not joyous or depressed, but just sort of in this similar experience. It'd be we might call it, as some people have, the hell of the same. There's no difference. There's nothing unique. There's nothing new. because it's all quantified, qualified, counted, computed.
Yeah, I do think you're hitting at something with the emotion of it. There also is, like, to your point about the quantification. I do think that's really important. That's one of the unique things about going into a digital medium that is distinct from, earlier revolutions. Like the printing press, sure, totally changed the way that we interacted with words because they became standardized. It went from every manuscript was different with the handwriting of each person to, well, now all of this is the same. There is a standardization that happens. And so when Jacques Ellul wrote The Technological Society, he was thinking about some of that standardization, the drive towards efficiency, the drive towards sameness. The digital step is a step towards turning everything into ones and zeros, like literally. Every pixel on the screen is an RGB number. It is no longer a skin color. It is an RGB. It's no longer your name. It's a that was given to you that has meaning behind it as it's spoken with its intonation. No, it's now just ones and zeros. It's bits and bytes. And because it goes into that medium, it becomes able to be quantified and measured. And so we increasingly live in a measurable society. Like obviously China with their social credit score is taking this to new extremes. But even in our day-to-day life, we sign up for it. We strap technology onto our bodies, and so that there's more quantification. My son's really excited because he just got a watch and now he gets to tell the time. And there's a part of me that's kind of sad about it because he is getting acclimatized to a way of life that is so focused on numbers, that isn't as focused on the length of time, high time, as Charles Taylor would call it. There's a way of living in life that's just one moment that's all quantifiable and everything's the sameness and measurable versus spending a night with each other where time passes by without knowing it. You don't measure the time because that's not your metric of reference. So anyways, it gets into the joy piece. It gets joy. Joy is immeasurable. Love is immeasurable. You can't track that on a chart. I can't say to my wife, here's the metrics on our love. Like, that's ridiculous.
I did that once, actually.
Did you? Yeah. Well,
yeah.
It's not. I used to work as I used to do a whole bunch of assessment for a company before. I've learned that some things cannot be measured.
Yeah. I think if we're going to have a more, like, in the last few minutes here to summarize, we didn't really answer the question, what is the image of God? Part of that's, I think, maybe too bold in a podcast to be able to say what many have attempted to say in whole books. But I do think minimally it's important to emphasize the elevation that the image of God gives to humans, the dignity that it gives to humans, and the association not only with what it is that we are in the image of God, but also the association with, however you want to define that association, with the particular mode of blessing that follows. So Genesis 1:27 in the image of God, in verse 28 says, "Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, take dominion," etc. However you want to actually define all the pieces of the puzzle, they're connected. And Phil brought up something vitally important that we didn't mention, and he only did slightly, is that being in the image and likeness of God does not require you to have a physiological feature, because if it did, then an infant wouldn't have the image of God, that because they wouldn't be able to do what an adult could, or someone born with a disability couldn't. You know what I mean? Like, it wouldn't make sense.
Right.
An infant is just the image of God as an adult, despite the fact they have different ability and functionality. Likewise, someone with a disability or someone who's born without a disability would equally be in the image of God. I think that's really important because sometimes people try to, I think, force the image of God into function to the point that that would actually be, I think, contrary to most of the Christian tradition, where it's really something you're created as.
Yeah.
However you wanted to fight that. And I think it's really important to maintain something around those lines so that we can affirm the dignity of those who are disabled in various ways and are not, who are infants or in the womb, or however you want to put that. Because if we don't affirm that and we tie it to function, you'll be very close to Joseph Fletcher, who I believe was in 1973 wrote and was a Canadian, I believe he was a Canadian thinker, and priest, or at least he was part of a church. He basically said that someone with Down syndrome is not a human person, and therefore, if born, you can just give away or abort, essentially. And part of that was based on his criteria of IQ, of what it means to be a human person, and functionality. So for me, I'm very shy to emphasize functionality beyond, being an act. Like, you act. I mean, Psalm 119:68 to me is really helpful. It says, the author says, who might be David, it's anonymous, says, of God, you are good and you do good. So act follows being. You are good and you do good. And I think that's a pretty common order of operations in the order of teaching in the Bible, that because God is good, he does good. And I think for us, because we're the image of God, we are the image of God, and we might act in that way. But those acts are the effects of being in the image of God and don't build up inductively to be in the image of God, or else we find ourselves in a place where those who are not equally able as others are less the image of God than others, and so on.
Yeah, and I know we're wrapping up, but it just jumps to my mind as you describe that, that the threats against this view of human dignity, come from a number of sides. As this understanding of the human person is lost, you think of the 20th century and of course the horrors of the Nazi regime. It's fresh in my mind because I'm reading a history of it now. But you look also at, you look at, I mean, on each side of the political spectrum, you see this downgrade of understanding what the human person is. And you look at the history of human rights, and it's definitely just an outworking or a secularizing of this Christian idea, which revolutionized the view of humanity in the ancient world. And it seems like we're really losing our grip on it as we look even in Canada at not only the abortion regime or the lack of any ability to have a conversation about it in Canada, but also the euthanasia, the way that it's just swept across our society and become normalized. That would not be possible if we had a robust understanding of the image of God for every human person from conception to natural death. The old and infirm need a lot of care, but if they're made in the image of God, then it changes the way that we look at that. So there's a lot of practical outworkings to having a rich understanding of the image of God, and there's a lot of pressures in our world today that mitigate against living out a good understanding of that. So the challenges are many for living out as people, as churches, and as a society what it means to be made in the image of God.
Yeah, if you do not have that, then you end up in scenarios where you're determining someone's value based around their function and their contribution to society. And so when you have a social safety or a social medical system that has costs, you're going to start to calculate the numbers, as has been done in Canada, in order to say, here's the cost benefit analysis if we were to go down that line. And that basically takes humanity and human persons down, like not just a level, but down to such an extreme degradation of what they actually are, to only be valuable based around what they do rather than who they are. And yeah, function follows form. Function of what we do follows who we are. And that's always been true in Christianity. It's always been true in Israel too. And I think it goes back. It's why, Cain Cain and Abel, the sin there, what you calls up to me from the ground, the reference to image of God throughout, both in Genesis 5 and then later in, I think, Genesis 8 or 9. Like it's a repeated refrain of the image of God. It's not used that much through Scripture, but it's used in ways that show its importance and how it remains true throughout. It does not degrade, at least the ontological aspect. So yeah, no, we need to champion it, even though there's factors pushing back on us. Wyatt, closing thoughts, and do you want to wrap up?
It'd be interesting. We could almost do another podcast on this and more of like maybe talk some through the biblical texts and things like that too. So I think closing thoughts are, it'd be kind of fun to maybe talk about this again. No, I think we just can be one of the things is slow to speak, slow to judge on some of the precise versions of the image of God. But I do think the way you opened the conversation made me sound like Kilner was saying like everyone disagrees. I'm actually not sure he's accurately characterizing his view as I heard it. But I think that's more often than not something that we tend to think that our ideas are more unique than they are. So yeah, I think with some of the image of God, we got to emphasize the goodness of the image of God. Even when we think of the Reformed, when they're talking about the damage to it, it's because of the doctrine of total depravity, which means that your soulish faculties, namely of the intellect and the will and the affections, are corrupted. And all of us would agree we have disordered passions. So Romans 7 is in the Bible. All of us would agree that although we know the truth, we often don't will it, which is Romans 1. All of us would agree that although we know God, we exchange the glory of God for corrupt things, which is also Romans 1. So there is some disorder in our internal life. That total depravity refers to the corruption of all of our faculties, not that they're as bad as they could be. So if you think the image of God is associated with your rational nature and your faculties are corrupted, then of course it's logical for you to say that the image of God is corrupted. So then upon explanation, sometimes the difference isn't as great as we'd all assume. We're all just, everyone agrees there's some sort of disorder happening. They might just slightly define the image of God differently, but in practice it's all very, very much the same. At the end of the day, though, the positive side that we should all be able to easily affirm is that the image of God does, in the sixth day of creation, does elevate us to be the summit of creation, the thing that moves God from saying good to very good, or a thing to very good, and the thing that I think gives dignity to everyone based on them being created as the image and as the likeness, but not based on their function, which of course follows from that created dignity. That's how I'd stop it.
Cool. Thanks for listening to Word and Words. Take care.